right, so in a way, review's just seeing where we are to this point in our study as we've been going through the book of Joshua. Joshua chapters 1 through 4, that's whenever Joshua comes on as far as taking over as the leader of Israel. He had certainly been there. Prior to this was one of the ones that was a faithful spy, as we've talked about, prior to this point in time. So we've been made familiar with him, but as you get to Joshua, he takes over as leader. Moses is now dead. Joshua takes over. And some different things that happen there. They send spies out to Jericho. They cross over the Jordan. You then get into Joshua 5 through 8, and they are now on the western side of the Jordan. So they've crossed over, and it's in 5 through 8 that we read about and discuss the conquering of both Jericho and Ai. Then in 9 through 12, we discuss the conquest to the south and to the north. Jericho and Ai are kind of in the middle portion, if you will, of the land that was promised to them and that they were going to go through and conquer. So they conquer Jericho and Ai, head down south, and then go up north and conquer various lands there. And then the last two classes, we went through chapters 13 through 21, and I lumped both those together as far as the lessons that we went through, talking about the dividing up of the land, the allotment of the land, the dividing up the land amongst the tribes of Israel. And so then that leads to chapter 22 through 24. Whenever we look at just kind of an overview, I like to do this just so we can see where we're going and what we're going to be talking about throughout class this morning. Again, we're going to go through 22 through 24. At this point in time, I'm going to ask this question. I know it's probably one I could ask later, but Joshua, where is he as far as this stage in his life? Younger, older, middle age? He's older, right? And so he's older. That was one of the reasons why he divided up the land, right? Or one of the reasons I was told him to divide up the land. You're old, you reached that point, so let's get the land divided up. And so what we're going to see now that the land has been distributed, it's been divided up, is Joshua's farewell speeches, if you will. Okay? First of all, in 22, we're going to see him send the eastern tribes home, those that were on the other side of the Jordan River. We're going to talk about that in Joshua 22. And then 23 and 24, he gives two separate speeches, if you will, before, as we get to the end of chapter 24, his passing. A scripture or a text, if you will, that serves as what this section is about. I mean, I know it's probably the easiest one I could have chosen because it's one that most of us think of when we think about Joshua in particular, and at this juncture of his life, this point of his life, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. You get that from Joshua 24:15. But that's really what this is about, right? We're going to see as we go through, they've conquered the land. He's going to remind them through these speeches of what God's done, not just in conquering of the land, but all the way back. And because of that, there's a logical conclusion of, hey, God's with you. He will continue to be with you, so you choose for yourself who you're going to serve. And this is really where Joshua ends. So, Joshua chapter 22. Joshua chapter 22. Number one out of the workbook. This book just really just kind of gives some questions that you work through. It says, who did Joshua bless and send away? Who did Joshua bless and send away? Okay, very good. The Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh. Those were the tribes that had been allotted land where? On the eastern side, right? So before they came over and they conquered. Before they came over and conquered, they allotted. Who was still living and who was the one that was in charge, who was leading Israel, who allotted them this land? Okay, very good. It was Moses. So, it was one of those things that I don't know why I hadn't necessarily thought about as I was going through, and if it just hit me just this time when I was studying, right? You think, okay, they're on that side, and then all of them stayed there, but that wasn't the case, right? What did those who were on the eastern side, especially the men of war, what did they do? They came and helped, right? They came and went on the conquest and the conquering of this territory. So it's not like it was divided up for them on the eastern side, and then all of them on those tribes just stayed home. They didn't, right? Men of war came over, and they especially went on this conquest and this conquering. And so now that the land, they've gotten to the point where they've gone through and they've conquered. They went on their conquest. They've conquered. They fought these battles. The land has had, as Scripture points out, I believe it says here that they had a little bit of a time of peace or of rest. He sends these home. Okay? And again, these are the tribes that were given land on that side of the Jordan River. Number one on the fill in the blank. Okay, so they're sent home. Okay, but what was told them? What was told them as they were leaving for their tents to the east? Hold fast to the commands of the Lord. We read number one, tribe. Does somebody just want to read that one for me? I'm trying to use the questions. What you get? Okay, very good. So those that were leaving over, right, they were told to hold fast to it, to keep the commands of the Lord, and to love Him with all their heart and soul. And that's kind of what we get from this section, right? This section. And not only does He tell them to go and do that, but does He commend them of something prior to sending them and saying, hey, so go on and hold fast to the commandments of the Lord? What did He commend them for in verse 2? You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have obeyed my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not left your brethren these many days up to this day, but have kept the charge of the commandments of the Lord your God. Okay? So they have been doing this. And it's one of the reasons why God was with them on this conquest and on this conquering of the land. They had been keeping the commandments of the Lord, and they were commended for that. And as they go, it's going to be told them, you need to continue to do this. I don't want to get too deep into that point because he gets into it more here in 23 and 24 that we're going to make some broader application, but just understand he's going to say the same thing to the tribes on the western side, right? So as he sends those on the east away, he commends them for the fact that they've been faithful, that they've kept the commands of the Lord, and he commands them to continue to do so, okay? And we're going to see the reason for that as we go on. Now, as he sends them on their way, are they sent empty-handed, if you will? What do they have? The spoils from the war, right? I mean, it wasn't, they didn't take absolutely everything, but they took a portion of it. It was divided up and took it with them. The spoils from the nations and the nations that were there, and took it with them as they crossed. Now, they get to the Jordan River, okay? And what do? I think I heard somebody say it. They build a... Okay, very good. They build an altar. Now, they build this altar, and what does Scripture say about that altar? It's a great altar, which would mean it's right. It's not like this little pile of rocks right there or something like that, right? They build something that is visible, is seen. It's great. It's big. All those types of things. Who hears about that? Okay, those that are on the west side, right? I started doing that too. I was like, west side, east side, But yeah, the west side. Those on the west side, they hear about that. Now, what do? They're upset, right? They're upset. And so, what do? They hear about that, they're upset, so what do? Go ahead, Matt. Okay, so they start to gather because they're going to go to war. Now, what do they ultimately end up doing before just going off to battle? Okay, very good. Why'd you do this? And so they sent some, right? Who did they send? Okay, Phineas. Who was Phineas? Okay, very good. So high priest. So they send him over. He wasn't by himself, though, right? There were some others that go with him, right? Other leaders that were there. And so they go, and whenever they get there, whenever they get there, they approach them and they ask them, what is going on? What is their thought? Those on the west side, right? The 9.5 tribes that are there. What is their thought that is going on? What is their fear? Okay, it's an idol, falling back into sin, potentially going here and doing things that you shouldn't be. Why was that such a big concern to them, though? Right? I mean, those guys are on the other side of the Jordan River. Why does that matter? Uh-huh. That's right. And what was the problem? What had happened, I guess? In the past, you have Achan, right? They point out the fact that, hey, whenever Achan did something that went against what God said, what happened? The whole nation suffered. It wasn't just us. Sorry, it wasn't just y'all. It wasn't just Achan, right? The whole nation suffered. He even points out something else. Or they even point out something else to them. It wasn't just Achan. They also pointed out another account. Right? What do they point out? Okay, so they're pointing out this account that happened, I believe it was back in Numbers, right? Numbers 25, somewhere in there, right? With Peor, and what ended up happening, right? They started bowing down and worshiping, and what happened to the whole congregation again? Plague, right? And the plague didn't. The plague occurred to them all again, right? It wasn't just to those people that were doing this. The thing that I'm wanting to point out is this: they recognize and they realize, wait a minute. The sin that happened, or the thing that happened to Achan, in the account with Achan, and this other account prior to that, those types of things, it doesn't just affect that one person, it affects us all. God punishes us all, and we're not going to let that happen. We can't let that happen. And so they go, and that's why they're approaching them, and they're pointing this out. Now, what was the conclusion, or as far as what was the explanation that those on the east side gave, the 2.5 tribes? What was the altar for, in other words? A witness. A witness to what? Okay, that they're not divided. And they were really concerned for what? Like that day and time, that generation necessarily? The generations to come, right? That one generate, we don't get generations down the line, and they're like, hey, well, why don't we care about those guys on the other side of the Jordan? Right? That's what it was for. One of the things that they do point out is, look, if we did this in an effort to rebel against God, to leave against God, what did they say? Yeah, I mean, have something happen to us right now, right? Telling you that is not what this was meant for. Did that satisfy or did that please Phineas and those on the west side of the river? Yes, it did, right? So they went back and gave word, and I guess, like a better way of putting it, all's well ends well, right? It ended well with that. They were frustrated. They were ready for war. But they came to a conclusion after going and talking to him that was not the case. Harry?
There's another element of what was said, and that was that the people Transjordan on the eastern side said, if we had come over there to worship and you said we don't have any right to, then this is a witness that we intend to go back over there.
Very good.
And so it was establishing not only that they were not meaning to do something against the Lord, but they were meaning this to secure their right to come back and do what God would have them to do.
They were using this to establish and show their every intention to continue to serve God as they should, right? And that's what it was for. And it was for their purposes. It was left at that. They weren't ever going to use it for anything else. And whenever that explanation was given, again, it ends up being one that is pleases Phineas and the others that come, and then they return to their separate places, to their separate lands of inheritance, and continue on from there. So something that could have ended up bad was something ended up being a battle between them. Ended up not being so after an explanation was given and a discussion was had. Yes, ma'am.
I think this is a typical, there's two sides to the story.
Right.
And you should always go to them and not just go by hearsay.
Some of the a lot of times, I guess, the things that we see, we like to jump to a conclusion. That happens to a lot of people. I don't know if it's just an American trait or if it's just all people, but people love to be the ones that, I saw this, and so they immediately jump to a conclusion. And you might be right, okay? They might have been right in this situation, but they weren't, right? And so before just jumping to a conclusion and going in battle array and going to war, go and find things out. Ask questions. Seek to make sure that you are all on the same page or that you understand what is going on fully. And whenever they did, or they made that choice to take, or Phineas and the 10 to go, they came to the conclusion and got the full story, if you will, right? Not just seeing what was there and immediately thinking that this is exactly what they're going to do. Now, you do see things that are cause of concern. They are commended for going and making sure that it was right. But they didn't go and immediately jump to battle, if you will. Kurt?
You've got to remember that they've just gone through an entire bunch of nations tearing down idols.
Yeah.
Noticing that all of these things that were erected were done so to for the purpose of or for the function of offering sacrifices and worshiping, someone or something other than Jehovah. So they were a little, tweaked about
That's right.
finding that their brethren had done the same thing. So maybe the pendulum swung the other direction, perhaps. But we get that way a little bit today.
Yeah.
We see a building with a steeple on it, or someone with something that looks like an object. Is that object a violation of what God wants us to do in our worship, or is that object just something that they've done in ignorance?
Whenever they saw this, or whenever this thing happened, especially given, what they're thinking about what had happened with Achan and other instances throughout their history, they had every right and were right to go and question, say, what is this? And that is something that we need to understand. If you see something wrong, you have every right to go get the story. Make sure that you get to the story before you start taking action. And if somebody does approach you, be humble about it. Don't be one that just flips out. Well, why are you coming at me? I'm just seeking to make sure that we all understand, we're all on the same page, and that things are being done according to God's will. Because this is how I've seen it go in the other direction. And if I didn't ask, and it ended up that way, right, what would happen then? And so we need, put yourself in both situations, on either side of this. It happens to us quite a bit today. We see what can happen whenever two sides come together, discuss it out. And in this situation, there was no intention of leaving the Lord at all, right? And so they have the conclusion that they come to. So that gets through 22, and then you get to 23. And when you get to Joshua chapter 23, what does Joshua do? Again, he's old. So what does he do in chapter 23? Jason?
He gives them warnings, reminds them what God has fulfilled and his promises that were made much earlier to them, that all have been fulfilled, nothing has failed, and love in a way that shows action.
That's right.
Their service to God, and warns them what will happen if they don't.
You're exactly right. I want to back up real quick. Who's he talking to in 23?
The leaders.
The leaders, right? He's talking to the leaders, and this is really, question, I think it's number 4 in your workbook. When Israel had rest and Joshua was old, whom did he call before him? Called the leaders, right? It's interesting because we know what does he do in chapter 24, and we'll get to this in a minute. I'm going to ask it again, but who's he talk to in chapter 24? Everybody. Who's he talk to first, though? Okay? And at the very least, he takes them aside, and he's talking to the leaders. Do you think that there's a point of application to be made there? There's something that we need to have an understanding or a recognition of? We see throughout Israelite history, throughout biblical history, and then even you get into the New Testament. What does God desire for his people? There to be what? Proper leadership, right? The elders in the New Testament, Old Testament, we have various things that are going on throughout time there. And here, Joshua pulls the pulls the leaders aside, and he has this conversation with them and talks to them. He's going to say something very similar to the entire congregation. But what I'm trying to point out is this. I believe that there's a point of application of seeing the need for good, strong leadership. And having that conversation with that leadership that, look, if you don't do the things that you are to be doing, this is what's going to happen. I'm getting into that a little bit more here in a minute. But for the leadership to understand the importance of their role and what needs to be done and the significance of a role that they have. And I think the fact that Joshua talks to the leaders of the tribes points that out. Because otherwise, why talk to them? Why not just say the thing to everybody and then leave it at that? There's a significance placed on leaders understanding the role that they play in leading the people. Eric?
Remember time when they went into the land, there was a 40-year gap of people that were missing. They had died in the wilderness. And so you didn't have anybody except Joshua and Caleb of that age group or of that generation. You had a lot that were younger than that, but they were the eldest of those that were going in. And it's them that he's trying to, this is pretty much a passing of the torch, saying it's going to be up to you now.
That's a really good point, and you take that application and make it to us. You're going to have a generation pass on, right? Moses passed on. It went on to Joshua and Caleb. Namely, Joshua passes away. Need another generation to step up, right? Whenever generations pass on, and whenever you have those who have been pillars, either whether it's been in a congregation, whatever the case may be in your life, and maybe it's your family spread out throughout the country, but you have some of those that are seen as leaders within your family, who's going to be the one that steps up and takes the torch, if you will, that continues to lead the way God wants you to. And that's what Joshua is going to tell them. Look, I'm going on. I'm going the way of all the earth, as he points out. And so you all are going to have to be those that take the torch and do the things that you were supposed to do. And he explains what that is. Now, whenever he explains what that is in this speech, this one here in 23, and I see it in 24 as well, I broke it down in my mind and just to make it simple for me, and I didn't put it like up on the PowerPoint necessarily, but the scriptures I will roll through it as you see. Really what I believe is you kind of have three parts to his speech. It's not necessarily this section, that section, a final section, but he has three things that he is saying. It goes along the lines of what Jason was saying. First of all, he calls to reminder, right? He calls to their remembrance what has been done, what God has done for them, what he has the capability to do, and the fact of what he said he will do. And then after he does that, he's like, because of this, there is therefore a conclusion of a call to faithfulness, to be faithful. And then at the end of that, there's a what? A warning if you don't, right? And in the midst of all that is the understanding of the hope, if you will, or the understanding of the protection that is there from God. And so we'll see that as we go throughout. A reminder, a call to worship, a call to faithfulness, and then a warning, if you will. And really, he gets into his speech or his discussion here with the leaders in 23, and he says these types of things. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you, for the Lord your God is he who has fought for you. See, I've divided to you by lot these nations that remain to be an inheritance for your tribes from the Jordan. Got off there. I've divided to you by lot these nations that remain to be an inheritance for your tribes from the Jordan with all the nations that I have cut off as far as the great sea westward. And all the Lord your God will expel them from before you and drive them out of your sight. So you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you. Jump ahead to verse 9. For the Lord has driven out from before you great and strong nations. But as for you, no one has been able to stand against you to this day. One man of you shall chase 1,000, for the Lord your God is he who fights for you, as he has promised. You see what I'm talking about with the way of reminder? What's he saying here?
You didn't do this by your power.
You didn't do this by your power, right? You guys that are now about to take over as leaders, remember the power that is behind you. You didn't do it by your power. And not only did you not do it by your power, remember what God has done for you throughout this time, right? And he had something in there that I think is interesting. What does he say about these nations that they defeated? They were great and strong. It wasn't like you went through and God helped you defeat these little nations that were meaningless, had no men of war, had no walls, nothing like that. Think about it. The walls of Jericho just fell down, right? Remember when we were in Joshua 10 and 11, they were talking about the number of soldiers or the number of military that had been amassed by these kings that came together. They were numbered as what? Sand on the seashore, right? Yet they defeated them. Remember these things. Calling to mind remembrance of who God is and that God is behind you. And not only that, but God defeated all these, but what had he done? He promised that that would happen. That shows God's faithfulness, his power, the fact that you can rely upon him. You know, when I was reading through something on this earlier, and I thought that this was earlier this week, and I thought that this was a good point. What Joshua is saying is that your faith in God's future protection has a firm foundation on something. And what's that firm foundation on? What he's done in the past, right? So your faith and what you need to stand on the fact that God's going to protect you and that you are going to be able to maintain this land, that's not just based on something that lacks evidence. It's full of evidence, full of their particular witness of what God had done in delivering them, right? One, out of Egypt, going back in their history, but two, here in fighting these battles. And so we recognize that and we see that. And so Joshua is calling to their mind and reminding them, this is who God is and this is what God has done for you. As a result of that, this is what you need to do. Verse 6, therefore be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. Lest you turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left, unless you go among these nations, these who remain among you, you shall not make mention of them. You shall not make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause anyone to swear by them. You shall not serve them, nor bow down to them. You shall hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. So, based off of what has happened, this is what the conclusion should be, and this is what you need to do. Whenever Joshua was giving them this speech, and whenever Joshua was talking about the fact, you guys need to be faithful to God, it isn't without evidence. And we can make that same application to us today. Whenever we start thinking about these types of things, about being faithful to God, trusting in God, doing what he says, holding fast to his commands, loving him with all of our heart and soul, that's not without evidence at all as to why we should be doing that, and it's not without evidence at all to the hope that we have. I hope that makes sense. And I see that here with Joshua's speech. It is chock full of evidence as to why that we should be doing these things. Not only that, so you first have the reminder of what God has done, and then you have a call to faithfulness, be faithful to him. But then there's a warning there. If you don't do that, what's going to happen? I don't want to read all this. I've been stumbling all over trying to read it anyways. What's going to happen if they don't?
God's anger will be against them.
Okay, very good. God's anger will be against them. In particular, what types of things are pointed out in Joshua 23? As he's talking to these leaders. This land that they had been given, what would happen? Say that again. Okay, they'll be destroyed. It'll be taken away from you, right? And you think about that. The same power that led you, that gave you this land, that promised it to you and gave it to you, he can that quickly take it away from you. It's not that he desires to take it away from you, but he's faithful to his word, right? We'll get to that more here in a minute on the fact that each side had something to do. God promised it to them, but once they get it, right, God promised it to them, but they had to hold up their end of the bargain as well, if you will, or their end as well. They had to be faithful. Okay? Scott?
History often repeats itself, and especially, bad history repeats itself if the people in the present, don't even know what their history was before. And history is there for us to learn and to know it and to learn by it. And if, we'll see that especially further as we get into the Old Testament where there's the good king, the bad king, and all that. But if you forget that God put you where you're at and all the good things, and you're not teaching it to your kids and them to their kids and so on, it gets forgotten and bad things happen. And you can learn from bad history. History's so important in everyday life and just learning from it.
Yeah, certainly whenever you think about the New Testament, it's talking about the Old Testament, these things were written, for our learning, right? And it points to the failures that were there at times with the children of Israel. And we can see the promise that's given by God and what's commanded of them, and then we'll see the way that it plays out. And it's something that we certainly need to learn from as we go. Jason? Oh, sorry. Sherry, do you have your hand up?
I just, if I could, JT, what you read about being very courageous,
That's right.
Sing. Who would think you would be arrested for singing? But anyway, so
You know,
it doesn't change ever. As long as I have lived, you fight against the evil ones or whatever.
that's right.
You must be very courageous. God, they're telling us, very courageous.
You know, that's a good point. And going back to that, remember, he says, therefore, be very courageous. The therefore is because he just stated something. If we back up further, it's because he just stated what God had done for him. Okay? Hey, remember, don't you ever forget the power that is behind you. Right? Don't ever forget what he's done for you, what he has the ability to do. Therefore, do what he says to do. Right? A lot of times what happens is we end up getting weak in our faith, or we lose that courage, right, to do the commands of the Lord and to keep and to do it. A lot of times I think it's because we lose sight of the fact, or it's not at the forefront of our mind, who God is. And the hope that is there, the protection that is there for us, the peace that is there. Do what God says to do, and everything's going to be okay. And that kind of leads to that statement, so I think it's a really good point. Larry? All right, sorry. Jason and then Larry. Sorry, Larry.
We have a very popular modern doctrine about premillennialism, and we still have political interest in Israel, and there's
Yeah.
a lot of talk about, have Israel establish this land, and this is a good section to refute that in verse
Yep.
15, that land promise that was given in Genesis 12:7 and 15:8.
No, that's exactly right. It was one of the things that I was gonna point out here, just going back or looking here at verse 14. Behold, this day I'm going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your soul that not one thing has failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spoke to you concerning you. All have come to pass for you. Not one word of them has failed. And then going back to chapter 21, it's chapter 21 at the end of the chapter, talking about the fact that all has been fulfilled, that the land has been given to them, refutes that common, and it is a very common doctrine of premillennialism, right, that shapes different political things. It isn't the intent here to get into that, but certainly make note of that. In an honest Bible student that's trying to study through these things, they need to consider Joshua and consider the fact that the promise of the land had been fulfilled, and from now on, what is it? Their keeping of it's conditional, right? And so that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. I know I had a couple other hands. Larry?
And Joshua 23 reminds me of the New Testament admonition Paul to Timothy and then to the elders about some would heed, there would be some that were falling away, and some of the errors that would creep into the church. And Joshua, in many ways, was telling the errors that were going to come to give them fair warning. And don't mingle with these people. Don't have anything to do with them.
Don't have anything to do with them. Don't let them have any kind of influence on them. Don't make mention of their names, any of those types of things. He tells them if you marry them and you start to do these types of things, he points out 4 different things. What are they going to be? They're going to be snares. They're going to be traps. They're going to be scourges on your sides and thorns in your eyes, right? It brings about problems, right? And so he points that out and is telling them, look, remember what God has done for you, okay? Who he is, therefore be faithful, and if you don't, I'm telling you these things are going to happen, and you want to avoid them. Well, how do you avoid them? You be faithful to God, right? Go ahead, Kurt.
Well, there's a hint here. Why does he have to warn them not to intermarry with the people if they already drove out all the people and destroyed the nations? Why does he have to warn them not to follow the ways of those gods if there's no one left to teach them those ways? And all of the idols are torn down. They did, we'll find out as we get into the first few chapters of Judges, they didn't do what God said.
That's right.
And now they have to be warned not to do this. But the other thing that I wanted to mention was the strong and courageous is not difficult to your enemies. Being strong and courageous to withhold the doctrine is difficult when it's your family members. When you look at the law of Moses, God's reaction to how people are to be treated that follow other gods, it's brutal. And that's when you have to be strong and courageous. When you have to stand up to your family members or your spouse, and you have to say, this is what God said, toe the line or be gone. Or on the law of Moses, it was toe the line or be dead, without remorse. And the children of Israel didn't do that. And they had problems with it all along.
Yeah. Oh, it's something that's definitely very applicable to us, and it's something that we need to take into consideration whenever we're thinking about these things. Guys, I'm sorry, I'm starting to run out of time, and I got to get through Joshua 24 in 5 minutes. So, DJ, is it quick? You can go. You sure? Hey, I'll rush through this and I'll come back to you. So, Joshua chapter 24, again, okay, so we talked about in 23, talking to the leaders. Get into Joshua 24, and it's all the congregation, right? And once again, I see a lot of the same things as far as what he says in his speech, if you will, right? He first starts reminding them of things, right? Reminds them of Abraham, the promises to him, and the fact that he pulled them out and guided them, and then reminds them, hey, remember you're in Egypt, and then remember the whole Red Sea thing, right? Talk to them about that. Talk to them about the Amorites and the conquering of those on the eastern side, on the Transjordan side. In particular, brought up the account of Balak and Balaam, and the fact that he didn't listen to Balaam, right? Because he was with the children of Israel. Then, hey, you crossed the Jordan. Remember what happened whenever you got across the Jordan? This is just capturing the Battle of Jericho. He does mention that, but he mentions the fact that you went throughout this region, right? And, I mean, basically, hey, I unleashed a hornet's nest on him, or I believe he put it somewhat in that way, right? God won this battle for them, and then reminds them of the promise, right? And what is he? I think it's real interesting. He comes to this. He goes, "This right here was the promise. This is after it's been divided up, right? I know I put a picture up there, but he points out what about this land? It's the land that you did not what? It is land you didn't labor for, vineyards you didn't plant, you didn't build any of this, you didn't do it. This was given to you." Right? And I meant to say this at the beginning, but it's real interesting because how Joshua puts it. Joshua, as he has the congregation together, who does he say is saying this? Joshua is obviously the one speaking it, but who does he say is saying it? This is what God says. And God's reminding them of all this, and then gets into the now therefore, right? Down to verse 14. Remember what God's done for you. Now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord, and if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's a choice that they were to make, right? It's a choice that they were to make. But remember, Joshua leads them to the conclusion that they should be coming to, right? Remember what God has done, so you do what you want to do, but I know what God has done. I know who he is, so I know who I'm going to serve. That's who me and my house, that's who we're going to serve. And there's a lot of application that can be made, a lot of doctrinal error that can be taught against with this section of Scripture, and we've done that before. But he gets to this point, he makes this statement. Now what do the children of Israel say? Yes, sir. That's exactly what we're going to do, right? They say in verses 16 through 18, they answered, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods." And one of the things that he did, that they do, is they go through and they're like, yeah, we remember these things. We remember what God has done. Therefore, we're going to serve him. And so this is the conclusion that they're going to come to, that they're going to do. One of the things that Joshua points out about God is that, look, I'm glad that you're saying that. Well, what does this mean? In what way do you serve him? In other words, he points out God is what kind of God? Jealous God, right? He goes through and points out some things. Their response to that is we are going to do what? We're going to serve him. What is Joshua, you think? One of the things as I'm reading through it, they said, yes, we will serve him. We remember what he's done. But Joshua is driving the point home. How do you serve him? Partially, somewhat, a little bit. Give him second. Right? It's a whole service to him, and I believe that's one of the things that he's pointing out, right? who God is and what you're doing. I hear you saying that you're going to serve him, but understand whenever you serve him, you need to be like Caleb, right? What did Caleb say back in Joshua? And I even talked through it, I think it was chapter 16 or 17. What did Joshua do? Wholeheartedly, right? Holy. And that is the point that Joshua is driving home. This promise, the thing that God has given you, he's given it to you, and it's conditioned you for you to keep it. It can't just be a partial service. It can't be halvesies or even 3/4, right? 75 or even 90-10. You serve God fully. And they said that they would. Not only did they said that they would, and I know I'm rushing through this. I'm sure people got comments. He sets up this stone, right, as a witness of what, as a reminder, right, those types of things of what God has said, and the people would remember not only what God has said, but potentially their response to it. What do we read in verse 31? It's talking about the fact that Joshua has passed. What does it point out? Those were what in that day? They did serve the Lord, right? Who had known all the works of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. Israel did serve the Lord. Now, we're going to see something different as we start to get into Judges, right? We're going to see this up and down and this going to service and out of, right, fully serving God and all those types of things. We know in this generation, they were witnesses to these things. They saw these things, and they made that commitment to God. There's a lot of application that can be made there. I wish I would have left myself a little bit more time to make some of it in chapter 24. But we understand the importance to it. We see it here in Joshua. Hopefully you guys enjoyed going through Joshua, and we will be picking up with Judges, lesson 7, starting Wednesday. Okay?